And so I wanted to use this quote, this phrase that I've been asked many times in, hello, can you see me? Yeah, hear me? Okay. I wanted to use this phrase that I've been asked on a number of occasions from my experience being in the academy as part of my title of this talk, because it really gets to the heart of my experiences in the UK academic institution. So this particular question that I have been asked, did you receive a special scholarship of some sort to be here, to be within this institution, connotes a number of complex assumptions, generalizations, and divisions. It throws up a lot of complexities, right? One of the first things that it connotes is an idea of space, particularly spatial separation or segregation. So when I'm asked this particular question in the academy, it implies in some way for me that I do not belong here, that I am somehow foreign or alien to the academy or the institution, that I have somehow snuck into a space that was not meant for me. Now, there have been many theories on space and the power of space. And there's a very good book in the history of geographical literature by a French philosopher called Henry Lefebvre. And he wrote a book called The Production of Space. And I'm just going to read out a quote from him that I think is really helpful in just beginning to think about how space is actually quite powerful. And it relates to this quote, to this phrase that I've been asked many times, you know, did you get a scholarship to be here? So Henry Lefebvre says, quote, space is not a scientific object removed from ideology or politics. It has always been political and strategic. There is an ideology of space, because space, which seems homogeneous, which appears as a whole in its objectivity, in its pure form, such as we determine it, is a social product. So that just kind of frames the idea that space is political. So when I've been asked this question, and the question in my title, you know, it connotes this idea of there being an inside of space and an outside of space. And that the fact that I am existing and present within the academy is almost a deviation, right? So the other thing that has always struck me about being asked this type of question is the sense that it must have taken something extraordinary to get me here, to get me into the UK Academy. So that I must have got my PhD from a special scholarship or program. Though innocent this question may first appear or sound, after being asked this very question a few times, I started to feel that there was something more insidious about being asked this question. So the question not only connotes a kind of hierarchy of space, a power over space, an ideology of space. Implicit in this question is the idea that I am somehow foreign to the academic institutional space, and that I have somehow come into here, and that this space does not belong to me. So it can feel quite alienating. And for me, it questions my very legitimacy to be within the academy in the first place. So my talk will be trying to unpick the complexities of race, space, and gender in the academy as I've experienced it. Now, we know that the history of the academy is an elitist one in which women and working class communities and communities of colour have historically struggled to access. But why now in the modern day do we still see and feel reflections of this elitism in the UK Academy? Why does it still persist? So the first topic that I wanted to tackle was race. So I've often wondered why I have faced difficulties and obstacles in my experience in the UK Academy, especially when I first entered the university. I thought that universities were meant to be places for free and open thought, a place to sort of expand the mind, right? what I found and what I have often encountered were closed minds. So, to put it simply, my feeling and my theory after being in the academy for many years is that the larger world is reflected within the academy. So, despite our hopes of being past race, of being a kind of rainbow nation, of melting pots and multiculturalism, we still have, unfortunately, in this world, a racial hierarchy which pits people with white skin and lighter skin at the top and people with black skin and darker skin at the bottom. That is the reality that we have to face and be honest about. Now, I think it's important to say this, to call it that, and to come to terms with that. I know that many people will resist the idea that we still currently live in a racially hierarchical world, but unfortunately we do, and it does exist. The hierarchy persists even though we have laws and policies that have been seemingly put in place to eradicate these ideas of racial hierarchies, right? But we still have it. So how do we work around that? And how does this affect our lives within the academy and with research? Well, what I wanted to do now to give us some sort of grounding in these ideas is to turn to one of my favorite philosophers. This is a Jamaican feminist philosopher called Sylvia Winter. She's very amazing. Now, Winter wanted to interrogate what it means to be human and what it means to be whole. Her critique of the concept of human was that it was a very narrow field that was often ascribed to certain bodies in this world. And these bodies were often always white and male bodies. So Winter talks about this in the figures of the man one and the man two. She says how man, particularly the European man, came to be considered the epitome of humanity, what she calls the overrepresentation of man. So she describes man one being the man of mysticism created by God, which gives way to man two, the modern man of rationality and science. So she wrote a really amazing article in 2003 called Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, Power, Truth, Freedom towards the Human After Man, Its Overrepresentation. And I'm just going to read out a short quote that I think help us understand where some of these complexities arise. So she says, quote, "The argument proposes that the struggle of our new millennium will be one between the ongoing imperative of securing the well-being of our present ethno-class, i.e. Western bourgeoisie, conception of the human, man, which overrepresents itself as if it were the human itself, and that of securing the well-being and therefore the full cognitive and behavioural autonomy of the human species itself, ourselves," end quote. So the historical and present world, Winter states, has been divided into these two figures that represent the human, the man one, the man two, which has come to mean the central figure of humanity. The entity that most possesses humanity is the figure, as I said, of the white, able-bodied male. And we are currently in phase two, man two, of this metaphysical construct of humanness in which rationality, science, and technology most inform humanity. So through colonialism, the image of the full and complete highest order of human was encapsulated by this figure. Women were not considered fully human, and people of color were also not able to access the human. Now, this is where I believe my place in the academy has thrown up complexities based on Winter's conception of one, man two, and who gets to access humanity, right? Now, how can I be in the academy, the university, as a woman and as a person of color, a person with dark skin, when the symbol of intelligence and rationality has been someone that looks different to me, that is the opposite of me almost? How can I exist and thrive within an institution in which the history of it is lined with colonialism, exploitation, and imperialism? So, for example, a university, the history of the academy, is a place where Immanuel Kant, a renowned post-Enlightenment philosopher, wrote in one of his academic theses that, quote, humanity has its highest degree of perfection in the white race. Okay, so this is a peer writing this many moons ago. So there have been many critiques of the conflation of race with intelligence within the academy and also outside of it. For example, Francois Fernan said, quote, when someone strives and strains to prove to me that Black men are as intelligent as white men, I say that intelligence has never saved anyone. And that is true, for if philosophy and intelligence are invoked to proclaim the equality of men, they have been employed to justify the extermination of men. So in short, I believe that this is why I have been met with difficulties on my journey into academia, because the figure of intelligence is still rested within a particular figure of humanity, and that is the white male mind. So coming in as a Black woman, this threatens and destabilizes this status quo, this power hierarchy of intelligence. So to put it rather more bluntly, the racial hierarchy in which we currently live, the insidious nature of racism, which we haven't got over yet, supports the idea that people with darker skin are somehow intellectually inferior, that men are more intelligent and rational than women, that humans with white skin are somehow more intellectually capable than humans with darker skin. So I've been doing an interview for my research project, Everyday Integration, which is based at the University of Bristol, with a lady from Cameroon living in the city. And we were discussing, and she was answering my questions in the interview. And one of the topics that we discussed was race and her experiences of race in Bristol. And she said to me that she still struggled with the idea of feeling inferior to the white race. So though I know it is hard for some people to believe that this colonial hierarchy of superiority still exists, because people quote the civil rights movement and all the pronouncements that we are equal, this still persists within institutions and within people's minds. And this is why I have had difficulties finding my place and feeling comfortable within the academy. So I, along with many other people from working class communities, were never meant to be here. The academy was made for the elite, middle and upper classes. So I've had to force my way in and hold my place as best as I can. So what kind of struggles have I faced? Well, the general stats about the UK Academy are not very promising, as we know. Currently, there are only, I think, 14 or 13 Black female professors in the UK. Growing up, I did not see many Black people in education. We were underrepresented in the academy. So this led to a sense that the academy was an impossible institution to access. For example, when I was conducting my PhD research, I'd done my PhD at Royal Holloway University in the field of ethnomusicology and cultural geography. Doing my research out in the field, out in various communities, people often would not believe that I was from the academy at all. They would not believe that I was doing a PhD, that I could actually be a researcher. So I would often have to enlist a white colleague or an academic to somehow legitimize or verify my presence, as alone I could not garner the respect that my white colleagues would receive automatically as a researcher. So my strategy during my PhD was to actually go to a place, a new place, with a white colleague of mine, an academic, so that I could be believed more and respected more as an academic. So this goes back to the question of space, the question of the power of Who gets to be here? And I think what's really interesting is that when I'm on campus, I often get the question of, why am I there? Why am I here on campus in the academy? When I am off campus doing research, people cannot quite believe that I'm from the academy. So sometimes in existing as a Black researcher in both spaces, both within the academy and outside of it, is a question of constantly having to legitimize your presence there and your value there. Another thing that I thought was really interesting about doing research was the feeling of being studied, of studying, but also being studied. So as I noted, doing research, it was often a question of people believing that I was actually from a university. And this always reminds me of an amazing writer called Francois Fernan, who wrote a book called Black Skin, White Masks. And he talks about this phenomenon, I can never say that word, of existing in a Black body in a Western world, majority white world. And he always, I always come back to this experience that he recounts of walking down the street in Paris, I think it was, and a white child, looks at him and freezes and says, "Look, a Negro." And he discusses the psychological implications of this and the way in which the white gaze can freeze and other a person, similar to the experiences that I've had in the academy. There have also been talks about this within the field of Afrofuturism, this idea that feeling like you are alienated leads to concepts of alienation, which is where we get a lot of Afrofuturist thought and art and speculative fiction. There's also a really amazing Black female academic called Azita Johnson. And she says, I will quote, that she always found it strange going to conferences and seminars with more pictures of Black and brown people on the presentation slides than Black and brown scholars present in the room. So one of the things that we have to deal with is being somewhat overrepresented in being studied, but not being the ones that study, right? That's a big problem that we are trying to remedy. Now, intersectionality is a really important concept to use here, as my experiences and struggles with acceptance in the academy have not only been due to the color of my skin, but also my gender. So this is why Kimberly Crenshaw developed intersectionality to address the erasure of women of color around discourses of race that focused on men of color, and to address the erasure of women of color around discussions of gender that focused on white women. So the intersection of race and gender is important here. The history of women in the academy is, of course, a very complex one. We know that, for example, the suffragettes movement was in part based upon women wanting to enter the academy to study when women were not allowed, as intelligence and intellectual capacity was solely reserved for the male mind. So my experience has been that my gender adds layers of complexity to my experience in the academy, as well as being Black and having dark skin, having Black skin. So Patricia Hilcott, who is a amazing Black feminist from the US, she talks about the Black female experience in the academy, and she says, quote, "The exclusion of Black women's ideas for mainstream academic discourse and the curious placement of African American women intellectuals in feminist thinking, Black social and political theories, and in other important thought such as US labor studies, has meant that US Black women intellectuals have found themselves in insider and in outsider within positions in many academic endeavors. The assumptions on which full group membership are based, whiteness for feminist thought, maleness for Black social and political thought, and the combination from mainstream scholarship all negate Black women's realities, prevented from becoming full insiders in any of these areas of inquiry. Black women remained in outsider within locations, individuals whose marginality provided a distinctive angle of vision on these intellectual and political entities, end quote. So I've experienced exactly what Patricia Hilcott has discussed in this quote. And I'm just going to relay a few examples here of some of the instances that I've experienced in the UK Academy. So a few years ago, actually, when I was doing my PhD, one of the first conferences that I attended, a guy, white guy, we were discussing all sorts of topics. And I'm not sure how we got onto the topic of race, but somehow it came up. And he said to me, well, you know, you're Black and you're a woman, so you are incredibly, and I won't say the words that he said to me, but they weren't very kind words. Now, this was an academic, and oddly enough, this was actually at a hip hop conference at the University of Cambridge. Now, this was my second year doing my PhD. I was at the University of Cambridge in this very elitist institution, and it was very difficult to know how to respond. But his comment always struck me as a kind of watershed moment. It was an awakening moment for me in the academy, in which I realized that my gender was seen just as much as an issue as my race or my skin color. So that was a very rude awakening to that. I just wanted to read another quote by Patricia Hilcott, who says, quote, "Producing intellectual work is generally not attributed to Black women artists and political activists. Especially in elite institutions of higher education, such women are typically viewed as objects of study, a classification that creates a false dichotomy between scholarship and activism, between thinking and doing. In contrast, examining the ideas and actions of these excluded groups in a way that views them as subjects reveals a world in which behavior is a statement of philosophy and which a vibrant, both and scholar activist tradition remains intact." So another example that I wanted to share with you from my experiences in the academy actually happened a few years ago in Bristol. So I joined the University of Bristol in 2019 on a research project, as I mentioned, called Everyday Integration. And I actually volunteered to be the chair of a session at a conference on ethnicity, of all things, in 2019 at the University of Bristol. So I was the chair of this session. I was in the room to set up. And as speakers came in, most of them consistently couldn't believe that I was the chair. "Where is the chair?" they asked. And I said it was me. Shocked, surprised faces, of course. I felt that if I was male or a different skin color, I would not have received so much shock and pushback for being a chair at this session. So then I felt an anxiety about how these academics would then view me. Would they respect me? Do they actually see me as their intellectual equal? So standing up there as the chair, I had to assert myself on a number of occasions. And standing there in front of them, in this room full of academics where I was acting as chair, I felt incredibly out of place. Partly brought on by my fellow academics questioning and being surprised at my being there, but also from my own insecurities of almost not feeling sure if it was my place, you know, if I was at home within the academy, if I could be respected despite my gender, despite the color of my skin. So again, I almost felt as if I had to justify my presence and speak that little louder, as we women often have to do in male-dominated spaces. So in a way, I kind of get it. People don't expect to see a Black woman as a chair, as an academic within the academy. So those academics that came into that room, they were not expecting a Black woman to be chairing at this conference. They were probably expecting to see a white man or a white woman. But they could make it easier for both of us by not sharing their absolute shock so overtly. I think that can help reduce the anxiety for women and people of colour that are just entering the academy. But on this particular occasion, it just really knocked my confidence, because I then had to command some sort of authority amongst academics that I felt did not see me as being equal to them in some way. I also felt in some way that because they were shocked to see me there, they were observing me in very close detail. So one of the issues, ironies, and complexities with being othered in the academy, with being different in the academy, is the dual experience of both lacking visibility and representation, but also at the same time being and feeling that you are over visible, that you are somehow being watched and observed very closely, because people haven't seen someone like you before speak at a conference or chair at a conference. So yeah, so that conference was a very, very interesting one. And it's the idea that your visibility, your presence within the academy is somehow a deviation, right? It's a deviation from the norm. So as Azita Johnson says, the Black feminist philosopher that I mentioned earlier, she says, quote, "We need to develop critical methodologies that examine structures, including the structuring of academic institutions that fix non-white racialized bodies as deviations that stand out against a white background," end quote. So what is the norm? What is the standard, and how can we broaden it? How can we make the academy more inclusive of people from traditionally underrepresented backgrounds, such as women, people of colour, working class people, people with disabilities, and so on? How can we make the academic space more inclusive? How long do I have left, Sado?
Just carry on, it's fine.
Oh, great. Yeah, so what I wanted to also touch upon was another philosopher who I think that we can think through and that can help us discuss some of these complex ideas, is a Black philosopher called W.E.B. Dubois. He talked about this complex notion, this peculiar position that Blacks in the Western world experience. He says that Black people have two souls and two thoughts, being both Black and Western, torn between two worlds, two ideals, and two identities. How is one's Black skin produced in relation to the white institutional gaze? Now, I'm not just including the academic institution here, but also other institutions where Black skin is cause for concern. So the educational establishment, the policing institution, borders, the judiciary system, in which having Black skin can cause you to be stopped and searched, arrested, deported, or can even cost you your life. So this is not just a discussion about the academic institutions, it's about the reflection of a broader issue that we have within our society, in which we have not yet reached colour blindness. So Dubois talks about how Black people, due to this othering of being tagged with this historical inferiority, being seen as second-class citizens, as dangerous, as unintellectual, have the experience of living in two bodies, in two consciousness. He says, I quote, "After the Egyptian and the Indian, the Greek and the Roman, the Mongolian, the Black is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps him from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is a history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. So this is how exactly I have felt within the academy. So this double consciousness, this two-ness that Dubois describes is the same kind of psychological experiences that I have had, and it's very alienating. Now, as I mentioned, I'm from a working class background, a South London background. Neither of my parents or anyone in my family went to university. So my experiences within the academy as a working class academic is something that many other working class academics can experience. But for example, a white working class person can blend in more, right? I can't. It's almost like, I kind of always say to people that it's almost like, when you go to a fancy dress party, or you think it's a fancy dress party and you're the only one in fancy dress and everyone turns around and looks at you. That's how I often feel when I walk into academic conferences where I am the only one that is maybe a woman or is Black. So it can feel very alienating, and it has at times affected my mental health. So I have had terrible anxiety attacks being at conferences in which I have felt very much othered, and I've been made to feel that I do not belong. But to close the talk, because I think I've been talking too long now, I just wanted to end on a positive note, and to say that despite the struggles that I've had, I have received a lot of support, care, and solidarity from friends that I have made in the academy that have become long life friends of all backgrounds and all classes. So that's something that I've taken from this experience. Also the experience of being involved with collectives. So as Nicole said in my introduction, I'm part of Sonic Cyberfeminisms. I'm part of many other academic collectives in which we get together and we provide communities of care. So to end this talk, I wanted to again end with a quote by Francois Fernan, who wrote this amazing book, Black Skin Masks. So I would definitely check it out if you have the time. He says, quote, "Superiority, inferiority. Why not simply try to touch the other, feel the other, discover each other?" So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you so much for that. So we
Thank you,
will. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you.
So we will open up for a Q&A, and shortly Natalie does have to leave us at it's 10 a.m. my time, but you're 2 p.m. your time. So we're going to leave off 17 minutes with her. Natalie, thank you for the conversation and for your talk. And a couple of things really stood out that I want to draw out of as it relates to the topic overall for this workshop. And it's timely that the citations you used are the same ones I have my students use right now in a class that I'm teaching on how do we reimagine higher ed outside of what we have now. So I think it's really timely to think through the citational practices you use, right? The tools of the academy that you had to deploy in order to make a space, right? So you're using this ideas of citations, of space, as a way to think about how race and racism not only are situated in our research of what we actually study, but also the ways in which we have to live that, right? And so it's the ways that you're talking about your story, the way that you tell your story is a way to bring the person, the lived experience into the space, right? A space that has told us, you know, in our training and our development, has disciplined us in our disciplines, right? To remove ourselves, that somehow we have to be the objective researcher who can then observe these situations and aspects of society and then give, quote unquote recommendation. And I
Yeah.
feel you're telling us that that's not how this works, right? I think you're saying that what we've been told, right, what we've been disciplined to think about has actually almost been a lie, because when you shake up the space, when you acknowledge the space as what you exactly said, political, strategic, and ideological, we have to understand then where and what is the political, strategic, and ideological space that we are in, right? And I think that's what really was interesting for what your talk did a great job of, is the space itself is trying to tell us, right? What I'm hearing you say is who and what is human. And what you are saying is that who and what is human is so limited, right? What Winter calls man one and man two is so limited. It is so confined in the imagination of only one population. You're asking us to really dream and open that up. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I am.
So then how do we do that? So, and I'm not saying you to fix it, but let's have a conversation, especially in a space in the British context, right, where we're asking really people in general, when we're talking about these concepts, is to bring themselves into a space, like to bring yourself in. But how do you bring yourself into spaces that have told us that to do that means that you are not legitimate, you're not intellectual enough, you're not rigorous enough, you can't, you can't quote unquote make it? How do we reconcile with these facets as we talk about a really complex topic, race and racism?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult, and it's taken me many years to feel confident and comfortable within the academy. So it's a lot of personal work and confidence building on an individual level, almost on a personal level. So kind of, telling yourself a mantra that you are enough, and that you are intelligent, and that you will not let anything tell you any different. Now, obviously, there's a very big difference between those personal affirmations and the actual structural barriers that are in place. And that's what's really difficult. So you can tell yourself these things, and that's what I do before I go to a conference. And then I might go to a conference and someone says something and all of that just crumbles. And then I question myself all over again. So it's constant work. It's constant work. So for me, I kind of fight this fight on two grounds, on the personal and the political, which are often conflated, and I think they are, because the political affects my personal very much. In terms of the political and the structural barriers, I think what we need to do is start taking control of the narrative, control of the way in which we are studied and the way in which we are discussed. So as I said in one of those quotes, one of my colleagues, Azita Johnson, who is a feminist academic, Black academic working in London, she said that she was struck by the fact that when she went to conferences, there were more people on the slides that were being discussed and studied than were actually in the room. So what we need to do is kind of turn that narrative round and have more of us within the academy studying our cultures, studying our communities, so that we can start to have some voice in the narratives that are written about us, and taking some of that power back. So I think it's about voice and scholarship, writing, getting out there, doing research, and just, owning the narrative a little bit more. But that takes a long time, and that takes a lot of emotional labor as well. So it's a lot of work.
I agree with that. And something you said there too, I'm glad you talked about the individual and the structural, right? And how those are the part of the issue. And you're doing something that I want to point out that I think is it's really beautiful how you're doing it, is the citational practices again, right? So you're talking about the research and who needs to do who's doing the research. But as we know, the academy, particularly in the UK context, it's majority white, right? So that when we talk about racial backgrounds, there is a preference of white academics. So if white academics are going to be looking at these concepts, particularly of BME communities and issues around race and racism, how does who we read and how we engage with those writings, right, influence then how we even understand the issues if we don't, how we engage with communities of color, right, in research and practice. Is my question making sense?
Yeah. So do you mean like, for example, who's on a syllabus?
Right, or who are the ones that are leading the thoughts. So you did a great job in your talk. You talked about, and you juxtaposed Kant, right, who was a very foundational philosopher of thinking about the humanity, how we think forward, how we work. You juxtaposed him with a number of different theorists, particularly Fanon, but also Winter, who really was talking back, right, to Kant and to a lot of these different philosophers of what is the human and who is the human. So why did you do that? And how do you think that shaped where you are today in understanding your space and place in the academy and how your research is impacted by that?
Yeah, I mean, reading Sylvia Winter and Patricia Hilcott and all of these great Black feminist authors completely changed my life, because they, you know, affirmed that I had a place in these institutions, that I could exist and that I could thrive in these institutions, because I was a woman of value. I was a human of value. I was a fully fledged human, and that the only reason why I was encountering these difficulties was because of this concept of the human and who has intelligence, who has rationality. So for me, it's very important to cite Black female authors and philosophers and academics, because they are often erased from historical narratives of the human. And as I sort of briefly mentioned, Kimberly Crenshaw, who developed this idea of intersectionality, she spoke about this. She said, hey, you know, Black women are often left out of the race conversations and the gender conversations. So this is a way that we can stop this erasure. So for me, it's very important to always bring in Black female authors and academics into talks that I'm doing, because growing up, I never knew that these people existed. I had no idea, and it would have given me so much more confidence to know of these authors when I was growing up. So I just want to kind of, you know, put that out there so that people can maybe be interested and read more and look more into these philosophers, because they're just amazing and they helped me a lot. So yeah.
That's so it's something that I heard you say that before opening up, the last thing is, it's interesting. So in these spaces that can be so dehumanizing, right? They also can be the places where you can find your humanity. And I hear you saying that you almost rediscovered your humanity through these works, through these other authors who've made their own space and place. So it's this weird slippage. This is why this work can be done in these spaces. We can critique all day long, but there's also, in the critique, there's possibility. And so I hear you saying that you stay. So I guess the question is, Natalie, then why do you stay? Why do you stay then with all of this?
So I stay because I think that the work that I'm doing is very interesting, and it is important for people of color to take control of the narratives and the scholarship that is written about us. So as I said, you know, most of the projects that are being led about communities of color, about women, are often not led by us. And so there's a lot that gets missed out. So for me, it's really important that I'm part of the academy so that I can lend my voice to these issues and these community concerns and these narratives. So it's all about voice and representation. And it's also, you know, because growing up, I never saw a Black woman as a teacher or a philosopher or anything like that. And I'm just hoping that me being in the academy, I can be a little bit of hope for, you know, not just Black girls, but working class girls, women, just to show them that, yes, you can exist within the academy. You are intelligent. You can do it. So yeah.
Okay. That's really important, because I didn't mean to cut you off, Natalie, but it's great because you're signaling that even if you can't yourself, it's not about doing it right now. It's about what are the tracks we're laying, right? So that the legacy that we leave does not be the same as the legacy we came into, right? So I think that's what I'm hearing. It's like you committed to the generations before you, and you're willing to do that work here. It reminds me of Pedagogy of the Oppressed a lot, when Freire says that, you know, it takes the oppressed to be able to show the oppressor one's humanity, right? Because that is where you find it. And there's this kind of interplay between oppressor and oppressed internally that we deal with as a way to think about how we externally work with others to show them what it means to be fully human, right?
Yeah.
And one way to do that is we have to really grapple with this idea of race and racism to show that that's a location of dehumanization. So if that's where dehumanization occurs, how do we then shift into a new humanity? So I think that's a great way for us to think about these things.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's
Love
great.
the talk. I'm going to stop talking, y'all. Sorry, I can talk all day long if you haven't noticed. So I want to open it up. We do have about 5 minutes left with Natalie herself before she has to go to another meeting, and then we'll curate the space and transition into the foot breakout groups. So do anyone have any questions or comments or something that's just on their mind they want to just either chat and put in the chat box or speak out? Yes, go ahead. I said somebody's hand up. Just go ahead and unmute yourself and say who you are, please.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
This is probably going to be way too big of a question, but I think that's okay. Thanks so much for your talk, Natalie. It sort of struck me around thinking about the kind of production of visuality as well, and the acceleration over the last decades of visual studies and visual culture and this emphasis on visuality, and that double bind around being simultaneously hypervisible or distinct in amongst this white background, and this invisibility kind of, or you know, like where there's this, you know, double bind. And I don't know, I know that's a complicated question, but it sort of just struck me around being a white person from Canada who now lives in the UK, and having gone to art school, I'm an artist, in the 90s, and there was just so much change in a way from art history to visual studies or visual culture studies, you know, around the 90s. And I don't know, I'm just wondering about that relationship at all.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been a visual turn, but I find visual cultures very, very interesting because a lot of the work I do is based on sound and the sonic. So I study Black sonic cultures in the UK and the US mainly, and the Caribbean. And what's really interesting is that in the field that I work in cultural geography, they have always been you know, thinking through the landscape through sight, through the visual. Whereas other cultures, you know, non-Western cultures often feel landscape through the sound, through sonic. So it's really interesting for me that visual cultures has gained prominence in the last few years, when sonic cultures, so the idea of sound being just an important sensory mode of being as sight, is something that is very important in non-Western cultures. So yeah, there's a lot to say about how sound and the academy, sound and sight and the academy work within narratives of Western and non-Western discourses. So yeah, very interesting.
And Natalie, there was one person, Astrid, excuse me if I mispronounced your name, who asked, I really like the idea of making space in the shape of communities of care. Do you have any experiences you can share of how to set these up so that they are supportive and open? So thinking about communities of care and how to set those up so they can be supportive and open.
Yeah, you know, I'm part of quite, you know, a few collectives that are communities of care. I think the first thing is to establish some kind of, you know, guidelines about how you want to treat each other and how you want to be treated. So very simple things like pronouns, you know, how someone wants to be addressed via their pronoun, whether someone is comfortable being touched. So for example, one thing that I've always said is that we should, in the academy, we should have a movement, a sort of don't touch my hair movement, because I have many times, you know, my hair being touched and things like that. But once you kind of set those guidelines and say, look, you know, I would like to be called this, and I'm not so comfortable with you touching my hair. Once you kind of get past those things that can cause initial discomfort, then that's when you can really develop some deep friendships with people from all different backgrounds. So I think it's just really important to first have very open and frank discussions about what people feel comfortable with, how people feel comfortable sharing. And then from there, you can create some really, really great activist work.
Perfect. Thank you, Natalie. Do you have time for one more at all, or do you have to
yeah,
go?
No, I've got time. Yeah, I've got definitely another 5 minutes. Yeah.
Perfect. I'm going through, and if I missed your question in the comment, forgive me. The next one that was asked was, thanks so much for the good presentation. I'm very interested in visibility. So how does your involvement in the academic support and the academy support your visibility? And also, I really like a lot of the Fernan work, and listening to you, I imagine what Fernan said, the Black destination is the white. So do you think these racist voices in the academy are occupying the inner intimate space inside of you?
Yes, they do. As I said, I've become, very anxious many times at conferences because I've allowed people's comments to get to me. And that's work that I've had to do. So yes, sometimes these comments and these experiences do occupy your mind, even beyond the conference itself. And that's something that I'm working on. So I'm trying to work on not letting things get to me. What was the first part of the question again?
Yes, the first part was, how did your involvement in the academy support your visibility?
Support my visibility.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think when I started my PhD, I, had no clue about anything to do with the academy. So I didn't even know what a paper was, for example. And I just, through trial and error, learned about, how to write papers, how to even conduct myself in the academy. But it was always really, really difficult because, as I said, there was always this dual experience of feeling both underrepresented and invisible, but also overly visible. So very much observed and studied and looked at and watched, and often met with, looks of complete shock that I would even be there. So, for example, when I joined my project at the University of Bristol, and I'd go around the city to different organisations, people would often be like, I cannot believe you're from the University of Bristol. We've never seen a Black person before represent the University of Bristol. So that always made me feel this weird sense of being overly visible, but then also underrepresented. It's a really strange, double, peculiar feeling that I haven't quite shaken, particularly in Bristol. So yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's about carving out a space and feeling confident within that space. So just, working on my scholarship, writing, reading, and just feeling confident in my own work. But that takes a very long time. So I've been in the academy for a couple of years and I'm still not there yet. And I think it's just going to be an ongoing project for the rest of my life or however long I'm in academia for.
Yeah, no, I completely, and that's actually a great segue into the very last question, but something you said about it's like you're always hyper visible and invisible, right? And a lot of folks in fat studies and Black fat studies talk about that too, right? Having bigger Black bodies and always being visible, but always being invisible at the same time, and how that collides.
Yeah.
And so the last question actually that before we have to go, is from Ian, and it's a great question about space. So you're talking about space a lot, and both physical and metaphorical, but thinking about traditional spaces, physical spaces within the academy, how can we think about physically redoing them, right, to make them more inclusive? So thinking about physical space along with the presentation of our bodies in the space.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is particularly important for people with disabilities. So just very simple things like making a space accessible for people with various disabilities. And, there are all sorts of disabilities that are visible and invisible. There's a lot of talk about neurodivergency. So I think doing those very practical things, making sure there's wheelchair access, making sure there's translation and transcripting for people that are hard of hearing. There are very kind of simple, practical things that we can do in institutions to make a space more inclusive and more open. One of the things that I've discussed that can be done is often when I'm in the academy, when I'm in the institution, when I'm at Bristol University, walking around, going to receptions, speaking to, you know, different departments, they immediately assume that I am a student and don't assume that I'm a member of staff, and again are surprised that I'm a member of staff, and I have to legitimize my presence again and again. So one of the things that can be practically done is for people to not always assume that a person of color is always a student, right? And to ask before you assume, okay, you're a student, ask, you know, are you a student or are you a staff? That's something that can be sort of just practically done to make people from communities of color and working class backgrounds feel more included in the academy, and that they're not so alien almost, right? And in terms of the actual physical space, I think that co-working is very important. So for example, academics can often be quite isolated and, you know, just sort of working on their thesis and articles all on their own. And I think creating co-working spaces is really important, because that can really lead to a kind of a collaboration of ideas. So I think creating spaces in which people can kind of mix and speak to each other. This can be something simple as just arranging chairs so that they're facing each other and they're not all facing the front. Creating breakout groups, which is what you're doing in this seminar. So there are simple measures that can be taken to kind of create a more inclusive, less top-down academic space.
Oh, thank you, Natalie. So, and just, I want to thank you for your time and for the information, because, and that last piece, especially what I heard you really say as a theme throughout all of this, and my colleague Matt Branch is telling me the same thing, is you're really talking about, well, are we intentional about who we're centering, right? And are we thinking about the relationships we have as a way to think about the spaces we're going to make and who belongs in those spaces, right? So and the first thing that we have to do is think about the assumptions we have about ourselves and others in the spaces we're in, and question those assumptions to get to the idea of who we're centering, why we're gathered, and how we relate to one another. Is that a fair way to sum up?
Yeah, definitely. That's perfect. Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting and great questions.
Yes, thanks so much, Natalie. And let's please give Natalie another round of applause and love for the time and effort. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of the session. I actually might be able to join in a little bit later, so I might pop back in, and would love to join in the conversations with you all. And thank you for being receptive and open to my experiences, and thanks again.
No problem.